Facebook's good. I don't know. Twitter is good. YouTube's good.
This is Matter Monday, and we're gonna wait a moment as we get all of our feeds going. So thank you for joining us tonight. Sorry, we're a few minutes late. We're still getting used to this whole being a mobile live streaming studio. We do thank our sponsors, and we'll thank them again tonight. But for those of you who are on so far, as we get all of our feeds up and running, we are here at 400 West Rich. It is part of 400 Square. It's a big artist complex and event space. And we are here in Wild Goose Creative's temporary space as they renovate their new space on this block here in Franklinton. So thank you, Wild Goose Creative and 400 West Rich Street for this space for Matter Mondays, which we host every Monday at 7 p.m. Can I get confirmation that all of our feeds are up and running before we really get rolling? Okay. It looks like we're good, so we're going to get going. If you have questions throughout this event, let us know. Drop us a comment. We will be checking those. So if you have questions or comments you'd like to make, please do that. First, we're going to introduce ourselves. And just to reiterate, this is Matter Monday. Our other sponsor is Night Road Studios, so they are live streaming all of these events for us. Let us know if you have any trouble hearing us on the feed. We are using masks tonight. Respecting the fact that we really need to be taking seriously the pandemic that's happening across the state and across the country. So thank you for being with us. My name is Cassie Young, co-founders of Matter Media and Matter News. And tonight I'm going to be hosting and really interviewing my two co-hosts here about the state of the local news industry. So we'll get more into exactly what we mean by that, but we're going to be talking about some really important trends in local news. And who I have with me tonight is...
Hey folks, last week and the week before, my name is Marissa Twig. I'm also a co-founder of Matter News and Greater Media. I'm editor and developer, so I oversee our editorial coverage here in Columbus, which is where we really started. Where Matter News really started with a lot of our reporting.
Hi, I'm Ethan Clewell. I was Matter News' first intern ever. I've also outside of Matter News, I work as a photojournalist stringer for the Green Star, which is about an hour north. I've done some work for some other rural papers, along with working for 70, which is an old college-based magazine that was under the 614 umbrella. I work mainly as a photojournalist, although I've reported on anything from Columbus reinvestment areas to sports.
And did you mention that you do still contribute for Matter News?
Oh yes, I still work for Matter News. Still mainly in photo, as well as Mary Stars mainly in photo.
Awesome, thank you so much. And Marissa, did you mention your other journalism experience outside of Matter News?
Oh yeah, so actually I worked freelance for the they are a very small community newspaper here in Columbus, but they also they have about 5 different circulation areas, and so they cover things like places from Madison County all the way over to Obetz, which is actually something that we'll talk a little bit about today. We're going to talk about News Desert.
And then you also wrote for The Land.
Oh yes, The Land. I was like, wait.
Your resume out for you.
I was like, both of us actually. Ethan and I met, and we were both reporters for The Lantern. I was the assistant photo editor during my time as reporter at The Lantern, and so that's how Ethan and I met. We kind of worked together on photos and on projects like that.
Great. Well, before we get really into things, I just want to remind y'all, or let you know in case you didn't, that this event is a series of events we're doing every Monday night at 7 p.m. through 2020. We are talking about different aspects of the news industry, and this is a fundraising event as part of our big annual fundraiser called News Match. Nonprofit like ours are matched anytime we get a donation. For example, the $5 that we suggest to donate to cover the cost of this event. will actually be doubled by Newsmatch. And if you decide to go to our website at matternews.org/join, and you can also go to links in all of our bios to find this, you can actually become a member, and that just means giving a small amount every month to Matter News. They will actually multiply your donation by 12, the whole year's worth of donations, so you can really multiply your impact on the evolution of the local news industry and independent and quality news for Columbus. By giving to Matter News, especially before the end of the year, so our fundraiser does go through the end of December. So you have quite a while to give and become a member. And we appreciate you giving anything you can to ensure that our content can stay free for others, regardless of their financial situation.
Just a quick note, Lindsay, it seems like we might be having some tech issues. Adam let us know that there's an audio issue where the output we hear seems to be jumping between the direct line from the individual mics and the ambient room mic. So the audio is kind of getting garbled and echoing, and it's creating a stuttering effect. So I don't know if it's because we're potentially recording on this camera as well, or if there's some other. We should be good now. If you in the audience want to let us know if the audio has returned, that would be awesome. Thank you so much, Adam, for letting us know. We appreciate you.
Those were so specific of instructions.
I know, that was really great. We appreciate that.
That is what we need. So yeah, let us know if the audio is sounding better, y'all. Great. Well, I hope that the audio was good enough that people could hear what the heck we've said so far. And if you couldn't, that's okay, because we're really just getting started. And if you're just joining us, we're just getting into things. So we are here. I am not a journalist by trade. Really, the first time I got into journalism was through founding Matter News after realizing that working in government, kind of research and reform, wasn't as fulfilling as I hoped it would be, because I realized we really needed basic community information to be able to achieve government change. So I'm really passionate about the local news, and I've been really diving into the news industry and how it works and the trends, but I myself don't have as much experience as my co-hosts here with actually working in the news industry. So I'm hoping that they can shed some light on our topic for tonight, which is the state of the local news. Have we heard anything about our audio? Is it sounding good? Great. Thank you so much to Night Road Studio for getting us right. You know, doing live stream setups like this are very tech intensive and difficult, so we really appreciate our sponsor, Night Road Studio, for bearing with us and getting us going. So we are talking about the fact that local news is endangered and what is left isn't so local anymore. And that leaves communities thirsty for information. In terms of kind of the overall trend of what's happening with the news industry, it's really important to know that most Americans, so most of you potentially watching this feed, although we like to think our Matter supporters are really in the know, so maybe y'all are a little bit different than most Americans, but most Americans think their local news media is doing well financially, according to Pew Research. 19% think it is doing very well, 51% think it is doing somewhat well, and only 6% got the answer right, which is that the industry is not doing too well at all. And this is a problem because Americans take pride in their local newspaper. According to Gallup, 59% of Americans see it as an important symbol of civic pride in their community, and more than 80% of Americans believe the news is critical or very important to democracy. And they're right, because people who consume local news are more likely to be civically engaged in their communities. Also, a recent study published in the Journal of Financial Economics found that government inefficiencies, taxes, and county deficits grow when a newspaper closes its doors, which is increasingly happening. It's important to note that Pew found communities of color are likely to rely on local news sources for information in their daily lives more so than their white counterparts. So I say all of this to demonstrate the fact that local news plays an important role in democracy and communities, and the majority of Americans recognize that. However, the vast majority of them are completely unaware of the reality of the decline of the news industry. We're going to be getting into more of the specifics of the decline of the news industry and what that looks like. But first, I just want to ask y'all, and this is for either of you that want to answer, why do you think that disconnect exists? Or just do you have any thoughts on that disconnect?
Yeah, I can go ahead and start. You know, I think about it like I think about a lot of other financial decisions that I personally have to make, right? At the end of the day, you know, I see this content being created, whether that's from my local news organization or whether that's from my favorite online creator or YouTuber or whatnot. And I just see all this content coming out, right? I don't, you know, you see the content, so you don't see, you know, the behind the scenes of really what's going on there. So when I'm making a financial decision, you know, I'm thinking about my personal interest or the things that, you know, are going to serve me in that moment when I need them. A lot of the times, you know, folks, even myself, are not thinking that, you know, local news is the thing that I need to pay for in order to support myself or to support, you know, learning in my community. But the reality is, this is how we get our information. This is how we hold our government officials accountable. And so, you know, at the end of the day, there's a little bit of that disconnect, you know, exists for many reasons. But, you know, one of the reasons that, you know, I've really seen is just people, you know, don't have the finances, especially right now, to be able to support things like this, right? I am, you know, 24. I'm working for a nonprofit. My budget is stretched very, very thin. Add on top of that a pandemic, you know, add on top of that an economic crisis. It's very difficult for people these days to be able to even afford investing and supporting in local news, even if they think it, you know, is critical, as the majority of Americans think, right? So that disconnect really exists because, you know, well, sorry, let me back up. Another reason that I think this disconnect exists is because, man, I was on a train, and that train just left my station, which is really funny because there's actually a train behind us. But I lost my train of thought, is what I'm trying to say.
You were on quite the train, so it's
it
okay
was.
that you got off track because you were roaring along and really speaking to me.
Yeah.
Just to add on top of that, I think problems with this stack. So when we have issues where we have less and less buyers or people paying for the local news, what that turns into is less and less budgets for those newsrooms. And so when you have less and less budgets, things like copy editors get cut first. But over time, it gets down to the fact that you start losing reporters. And so from rural communities, you end up having towns that have 2 reporters for the entire town. And so what that means is the stories can only be, they're not worthless. They're definitely they definitely have a lot of worth to them, but they get less and less worthy compared to how it used to be when you had, you know, one person being able to cover a beat. It's tougher to cover 5 beats at once rather than cover your one beat. Typically.
Yeah, and so like that, I think maybe the word you look impactful. You know,
Yeah.
like it's not that these stories aren't worthy. We have reporters who are out there doing the work, putting the time in and day out. But at the end of the day, their brains, their workload is stretched so thin because their budgets from the top have been slashed. That then at the end of the day, they're reporting on things that they can grab, you know, that they can get their hands on. And not all the time is that reporting on things like government accountability. In my experience working for the Columbus Messenger, I covered Obetz, which is a really small town. It's a village, which this year it's probably transitioning into a city just because of its population size, that is on the eastern side of Columbus. And that's where for any Crew fans out there, that's where the Columbus Crew Stadium is. I was the only reporter covering Obetz, just solely dedicated to Obetz, and I covered their government meetings. But now there's no one else there, and so at the end of the day, community newspapers, local newspapers, they don't have the money to be able to send people out to all of the places that they need to. I think I'm getting a little bit away from the original question, though.
That's
so
totally
I'll let Cassie
cool.
take back
Hey,
over.
I am the type of person who is all about kind of going on tangents and stuff, and I figured some of the answers y'all might have to these initial questions will lead to where I'm going anyway, which is exactly what you were doing, Ethan, by starting to talk about like the cuts and things like that. We'll talk a little bit more about specifically the cuts. Did you have something else you wanted to interject?
I did. So this might be specifically on the disconnect. I will also add that like there could be, I don't know if it exists as much as I think it does, but at the end of the day, a paper always gets produced, right? There's always, it somehow works like magic because you could have a hole with an hour to go with your deadline, but there is always a paper produced. And so people, they go by, they might not buy it, but they see that it's still there. And so that might also create the disconnect of people believing that the news industry is much more well financially than it is.
Also, before we move on, the train came back to the station, y'all. It's back here. The other reason is that local news organizations in general, don't talk about these problems. It requires a level of vulnerability and a level of being able to be wholly authentic and wholly honest with the public about the reality of the industry that we're in. We try to be very transparent about what challenges we face, especially as a small nonprofit in this city. And part of that disconnect is that there's not mainstream reporting happening. There is mainstream reporting happening. Now, whether or not it hits your news feeds, right, is the question. Is that something that's in your echo chamber? Is that something that's in your social media bubble? Because that's where the majority of people are getting their news these days, is online. So is information about this problem even hitting your sphere? And that, comes into, thinking about how accessible is local news and how accessible are local journalists. Because if you're not interacting with the community isn't going to understand, the actual issues that are being faced by these organizations, by these companies. And so it's not just on the consumer of news, it's also on the producer of news to be able to, authentically and be vulnerable about the reality of this situation.
And I think something that's sparked by what you were saying about like news being made anyway, I think first of all, it's like, that's different depending on where you're at. So especially in a Columbus, yeah, it may feel like you still have a decent amount of news choices, rural places, communities where they used to have a paper and now they don't. It might feel a little bit different. But I think the other thing to think about that you made me think of is like, yeah, the fact that a lot of news has been cheapened and a lot of the journalism that happens nowadays does not resemble the journalism that, we're necessarily, well, not me, but others are taught in journalism school and, really should be following because of the 24-hour news cycle and advertisements and whatnot. So it's just really interesting to kind of think about the nuance there. All right, so let's talk a little bit about consolidation. So consolidation, if you're unfamiliar, is the idea, and this has happened in industries, really all kinds of industries throughout the United States over the last decades. They've been consolidating. So whereas we used to have a rich diversity of ownership of things like media, banks, etc., nowadays you can see just the way that over the years many entities have shrunk to just a handful of entities, especially on a national level, that control a large share of the market. And so the media industry, the news industry, is no exception. And consolidation of local news here has really played out over the last decade. And so I just want to give you an idea of what this looks like on a local level more specifically. In 2011, the Dispatch Printing Company, so our hometown paper, the company that owns them, that used to be family owned, at the time it was owned by the Wolf family, and they bought up many small papers and shut down half of the neighborhood papers in Central Ohio. They also shut down the other paper, which was kind of an alternative paper that they bought and shut down. And then in 2015, the Dispatch Printing Company was bought by the largest newspaper conglomerate in the country, which also owns Columbus CEO, Columbus Alive, and Columbus Monthly, among others. So you tend to think of all of these different, news sources in Columbus, but they're ultimately owned by the same big company based elsewhere, which in 2019 merged with the second largest newspaper conglomeration in the country, meaning that 5 of the nation's largest news chains now own nearly 120 newspapers in Ohio, and the largest newspaper in the paper company in the U.S., this company owned only a handful of newspapers in Ohio before 2015. Now they own 61. So if you see a map of this trend, we've posted one on social media before. It's quite striking to see just how much, is owned. And so it leaves us feeling like the local news isn't so local anymore, and it's really endangered because it's being cut because of a lot of these trends. So, Ethan, I want to know, especially because you've worked for quite a few different publications in some different places, how have you seen conglomeration play out, or have you seen it, and what's just your opinion sort of on it? Yeah.
So my opinion as a whole, out like taking myself out of the situation. Um, if it works, it works. Um, I guess it's tough. I do see some good in it, actually, a little bit, with being able to have sister papers to rely on for state information. Um,
Explain what you mean by that.
So, for instance, the Marion Star and the Columbus Dispatch are now sister papers. They used to not be. Marion Star with Gannett, Columbus Dispatch with Gatehouse. And so, actually, it also works with Cincinnati's paper. So the Cincinnati Enquirer's State House reporters, who I admire, terrific reporters, their work in the State House gets to be published in the Marion Star, which from a state level and a state understanding, that fits, and I actually kind of like that as a reader. I guess from my own personal experience, to me it hasn't really changed anything. I think that's only because I entered with that being the situation. So I didn't necessarily, for as long as I've worked for the Marion Star, it's always been a Gannett paper.
And just to be clear, Gannett is one of that second conglomerate that merged with Gatehouse, which is the first conglomerate that I was just referring to, that owned the paper he's talking about.
And so to me, the workflow doesn't. I guess my thing is when I look at the Marion Star, it's kind of the same as I look at Matter News in a very different way. So when I look at the Marion Star, I don't look at it as this Gannett paper. I look at it as my hometown paper. And I look at it as working with the people, working with the editor, working with the writers, and working with the sports writers. Just as the same as I look at Matter News, I don't necessarily see it as working. I do see the working with the independent news, but I see it as working with you and working with Riss and working with Jay.
Can I interject with a question?
Yes.
What then is your experience? Because I get that you're saying in ways that there's similarities. What, if anything, you perceive then is different in terms of having ownership, your company being owned? Like, you didn't notice really any difference, or?
No. I will say there are definitely some big differences. One of which is deadlines. So deadlines, I believe, don't quote me on this, I know deadlines tend to be early in the afternoon for the Marion Star for the next day's paper. And that typically tends to be a very early, a lot of news happens after 2 p.m. Whereas working with an independent paper, I think there's a little bit more leeway and a little bit more understanding, and I think projects and deep dives tend to be a lot more friendly with independent work. One of the big things is, and I got this from even the small paper I worked out in Indiana for a little bit, you're still a 40-hour work week. And so when you're a journalist, that ends up being a problem where you get to 39 hours, and it's like, okay, I have this, and this to do, and I got to cover it within that 40-hour period. And that, I don't believe, is the same situation here.
Mm-hmm. And so do you, in terms of decision making, because I get that the time frames and the publishing deadlines and things are a decision coming down potentially from the top, and kind of how that's rigid. But in terms of I don't know, just any other management of that affects your work, did you ever perceive that any of that was coming from above just the direct people you were working with at the Marion Star? And it's okay if you can't talk about some of these things or comment on it. But.
So, not Not really. I do think that the Marion Star is a very wonderful crew. Um, I don't necessarily. I can't say that I have. If it's existed, I haven't seen it.
That's really interesting because I feel like, even me myself, I tend to perceive that, there's at least some direction coming down from like boardrooms at these companies in other states. And I have always been curious kind of like what decisions really are just left to the Columbus Dispatch or the Marion Star versus like what kind of constraints come down from like corporate, for example.
Can I? I will say, anytime I've done like a gallery or a photo story, everything that I've ran has gone through. And I don't think that there's never been a time where I've sent something in, and I've sent some things in that can be harsh or can be very critiquing to um, whatever culture, and yeah, I haven't felt those cuts.
You haven't felt like censorship, it
No,
sounds like. You
no.
haven't felt like there was much editorial control coming from somewhere that like was kind of curtailing you. That's interesting. I just wanted to kind of go down that little path because I was really curious. Did you have something you wanted to add about it?
Yeah, so I think some of these kind of issues with conglomeration, we don't always see them. It's hard to figure out, some of these issues, right? I think some of the biggest things that I've really seen is the strategy. So you mentioned deadlines, right? I think one of the biggest issues with conglomeration is output. At the end of the day, these companies have to turn a profit. And it is really hard to turn a profit with a newspaper these days. Conglomeration happened, consolidation happened because there's a lot of shareholders at the end of the day, it's corporate owned media, and there's a lot of shareholders. And at the end of the day, investors need to be able to make a profit on the things that they've invested in. So in terms of consolidation, a lot of these issues, I've seen, tweets from editors saying, our decisions are made locally here, right? I've specifically seen Alan Miller, write about that from the Dispatch, right? But what it seems like are some of these issues like ads, right? What ads are appropriate for our community? I mean, just the other day, I was reading. It was November 11th. It was Veterans Day. And there was this beautiful Veterans Day story about World War II. And right under that was an ad with like 7 women in bridesmaids dresses with their dresses pulled up and their butts are peeking out. And to me, as a reader, I see World War II coverage, and then I see this ad that is talking about, the ad literally says, the photographer wasn't expecting this, take a closer look. And I'm like, you want me to look at this? So to me, those financial priorities are they look a lot different at the consolidated level. And so at the end of the day, they need people to click those things, right? They need people to click that ad after they read that story so that those shareholders can get a profit. And so you see some of these decisions like that being made in some of these consolidated newsrooms. At the end of the day, people, and a lot of local decisions about those ads aren't being made. Those are being made by the Gannett's, by the Gatehouses, by the people who control that financial capital, right? So yeah.
I think a theme that we're pulling out is, that conglomeration often kind of tied up in that is sort of the fact that, the model is corporate and the advertiser model is wrapped up in there, but also the fact that, and I'm not an expert on any of this stuff, but like hedge funds own a lot of these and are like their whole point is to trim, like you were saying, with their investors. So it's just like the priorities are really interesting. So a lot of we've already talked a little bit about the decline of the industry and what that means in terms of cuts, and that's kind of where we're going with this. But I wanted to hone in a little bit more on that. Because local news is disappearing in Ohio. We were saying that, like I was saying earlier, I think it just depends where you're at, whether you notice how bad the state of local news is. And in places like Youngstown, Ohio, they felt that for real. I don't remember if it was this year or if we were back in 2019 when they lost their city paper. But Youngstown was left without a paper, after having one. And I think the paper was around for a really long time. And so in line with that trend, Ohio has lost 40% of its newspaper journalists from 2012 to 2019. Franklin County lost 63% of its newspaper jobs from 2004 to 2017. So that's pretty wild. In our county over the last decade and a half, we've lost over half of our newspaper jobs. And then this year alone, I know the Dispatch, Columbus Alive, and other local and corporate-owned outlets have made announcements about cuts to their newsrooms. So it's definitely true that here in Columbus, the industry is very much being cut. These newsrooms are getting smaller. People's workloads are getting bigger. And unlike a Matter News, who kind of hones in, a lot of these outlets are trying to cover everything under the sun. So, their beats aren't, from what I see, getting any smaller. But there's, fewer people, I think, in these newsrooms producing that news. So Ethan and Marissa, really these are same questions kind of as before. Do these statistics bring anything up for you in terms of what you've seen in your work or for the news in the news industry generally?
So speaking on the news industry or the news job industry specifically, a few months, it was right before COVID hit. There was a job opening at a paper I knew, and at the last second I decided not to apply. But I actually had a friend, close friend of ours, apply. She got the job. 3 weeks later, she was laid off from that job. Within 3 weeks of picking up her life and moving it, she had lost it. Thankfully, she is back at another local paper. She's an editor, everything.
Do you know, did they change ownership?
No. It was a strict, it was basically a COVID cut. I mean,
okay.
That's where that all sort of came from, because this paper is independent.
And talk a bit, do you know why papers were having to make cuts due to COVID?
So I think,
I'm assuming that small businesses and people and other businesses that advertise with them couldn't afford to do so at quite the same rate. Because advertising's, the big driver. I mean, membership has its drive. It's not, but advertising tends to be the big driving force behind any newspaper's profit. One of the things I actually remember hearing from Andrew Yang during a podcast was COVID didn't necessarily always create all the problems that we're facing now, but it certainly exacerbated some of the trends that we were going towards. And the news trend was going down before COVID ever hit. The trend was leaning down. So it's no surprise that COVID, when it hit, it's exacerbated many of these problems. Yeah, definitely agree with you there. Do you have any thoughts on that before we move on, Maris?
I actually want to share a story from another one of our reporters that we had for a moment of time. Last year, we were working with a contributor named James, and he had gone to OSU for journalism, probably in 2012, I think, was when he had graduated, around then, and went to school for journalism. He moved out west, found a paper in his home state of Colorado to work for. Don't quote me on the paper. I don't remember the name. But he was working for this paper, and, he saw this job description, and it was copy editing and copywriting, hybrid position. And so for anyone, we're using a lot of, journalism speak here. Copywriting is you're just writing the news, essentially. You're writing copy. You're writing text. Copy editing is you're just editing that text. And so this was a hybrid position. That's a little unheard of. Maybe I shouldn't say unheard of, but that is two jobs in one. And so, for him, he said he was really excited about this. He was like, wow, this is what an opportunity for me to get right out of school. He interviewed, got the position. He got there, and a week after he had joined the team, the person who trained him quit. And then from there, the rest of the staff ended up quitting, down to where there were only 3 people in the entire newsroom who had to print a paper, who had to write, edit, design, and print a newspaper every single night. 3 people had to do that. And if that, so when it comes to declines and cuts, a lot of these small town newspapers are teams of 3 to 5 people. because they have these, corporate-owned groups. But at the end of the day, when you have a paper that is that small, serves that small of a market of a community, right? They've got to make decisions. And so he ended up leaving the industry entirely after about 2 more jobs like that, and said, I can't do this, And this is it burns people out. And a lot of journalists get burnt out and end up moving into public relations or marketing or communication because it's easier to make more money in those positions, right? So then not only are we losing local news, we're just losing journalists entirely in these cuts. And that leaves, like we said, communities thirsty for information. We have a lot of issues where people are just, people are leaving the industry because there's no money to be made. There's not a lot of money to be made unless you're one of those coastal elite journalists working at the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times. But there's a stat that's like, I think it's, Jalen probably knows this, but it's like 60%, I believe, of people, of journalists work on the coast. 60, is it 60? It is 60 or above. I know that for a fact. I don't remember the exact percentage, but there is a large portion of our journalists who work on the coast, and that we have 50 states in this nation, and a lot of rural communities, a lot of villages and towns. When I was working for the Columbus Messenger, like I said previously, I was the only reporter covering OBETs, and actually I had retweeted our event promo for tonight just before we started, and someone had actually messaged me and said, you used to cover a news desert. And I was like, wow, you're right, yes, this happened. And so at the end of the day, that paper could only afford to hire one person, and I made $40. I'll be fully transparent. I could be at a meeting for 3 hours, spend 2 more hours writing a story, and another hour editing photos, and still, my freelance paycheck was only
6 hours.
So 6 hours total was $40, and that's before taxes. So a lot of...
It's not minimum wage.
It's not even minimum wage. So a lot of people, get out of the industry just because they can't even afford to make a living wage on this. So not only are we losing it because of, buyouts and because of, cuts, we're losing it because people just can't afford to live on this industry sometimes. And we face that, a lot of times, we feel bad because we're trying to make sure that we can afford to pay, interns, we can afford to pay contributors, living rates. And it's really, really difficult to do. Anyways, I'm going down a whole rabbit hole
No, I'm
again.
glad you went down the road of talking about the human impact, because humans, like, at the end of the day, I get really frustrated that in a lot of things we don't focus enough on the humans that are doing the actual work. And at the end of the day, we do try to walk a fine line between, we are critical of the traditional and corporate news industry, but we also want to make sure that we're paying our due respect to what they do, the work that they do, and their journalists, and separate our criticism of maybe their model and some of the things, some of their practices from, the journalists that are really trying their best within the constraints that they're given. Go ahead, Ethan.
Oh, sorry. If you want to finish,
That was it.
That was it?
I'm going to
Okay.
go to you next.
Oh.
I was really just,
So
I don't know.
I just wanted to touch up on Marissa's hybrid jobs because while, most jobs aren't hybrid jobs, it's a very small number. Specifically for photojournalists, I don't know how many you could see where you're not just getting hired to be a photographer, you're getting hired to be a writer and photographer. And sometimes I'll ask what that workload is because that's an important thing to know. And I remember a lot of them is, you're still producing as a writer 5 stories a week, writing-wise. On top of that, you're doing photojournalism duties, and when you're doing photojournalism duties, you tend to do them for other reporters as well. On top of that, they also want photo stories. So there is a full, when we talk about these hybrid jobs, you're talking about trying to do 60 to 80 hours of work within a 40-hour work week and being underpaid to do that.
That was exactly what I was going to ask you next. So that was perfect. That was perfect. And it's kind of sad, but at least there's camaraderie in it. That whether you're a freelance reporter or you're working for the Dispatch or you're you are founding Matter News or working for an independent, nonprofit news outlet, across the board in the news industry, you're overworked, you're likely burning out, you're likely underpaid and struggling for money unless you're really established in your career. And that's a big concern because especially, our team and the people that tend to contribute content to us are younger. So, we don't have as much of that. And so the industry is really, I think, fragile in that way, unfortunately. All right. So the last thing that I want to say, and then we can also, just as a reminder, if you have any questions you want to submit, go ahead and do that, and we'll just finish up this last little topic I want to talk about, and then take any questions we've got. So we won't dive too far into these topics, and we'll just take about 5 or so minutes on this because 2 of these topics we'll be talking about at Future Matter Mondays a little bit more in depth. On December 2nd, on Matter Monday at 7 p.m., we will be discussing the importance of independent and nonprofit media more in depth. And so, sorry, I'm really struggling with this mask here. The great news is that nonprofit and independent news is on the rise. And that's what we'll be talking about more that week. But we just want to let you know a little bit about it. So we are, like we said at the beginning of this, like you're probably seeing on your screen right now, we are doing this event as part of a big fundraiser. And it is a national fundraiser, and they saw an increase of 35% in the amount of newsrooms, nonprofit newsrooms that are participating this year. So nonprofit newsrooms are on the rise. I forget the overall percentage of how much they're growing per year, but at least in terms of how many are getting in on this fundraiser, it's 35%. So it's really a growing thing. We are fiscally sponsored currently until we become our own full-on nonprofit by the Institute for Nonprofit News, which has over, I think now, like 250 members in the United States, nonprofit newsrooms across the United States. And so it's just been basically growing. The other thing is that really we have to talk about, so I just kind of wanted to mention that, kind of like the things that we're doing are very much nationally kind of replacing what is dying and is kind of what's rising out of the ashes. What I want to talk about a little bit more is the reality of what it will take to save, whether we're talking about corporate news or independent news or whatever model you want to go with. Financially speaking, the American Journalism Project has estimated that the U.S. needs to raise $1 billion, and I think that's over the next decade, but I honestly can't remember, so I should have included that. I apologize. But if you Google it, you can find it. And so they actually intend to raise that $1 billion to invest into the local news industry. And they think that we need $1 billion from their analysis to really have a local news industry that's fully operating healthfully. And they are primarily looking to fund nonprofit models like ours. So young people, another thing that I think is really interesting is young people are often, and you talked a little bit about this, we kind of started talking about it at the beginning, but young people are often used as scapegoats for the decline of local news. And how many times have we heard young people just don't care about paying for the news, they don't value it, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to talk more about this on next Matter Monday and who funds the news and stuff like that. But to kind of put that on its head, studies have found that among the elderly, middle-aged, and young, the elderly are the most likely to pay for news subscriptions. So that's usually what I feel like we're hearing about in those kind of gripes. But young people are the most likely to donate to news organizations and pay for memberships. So the future of news may be nonprofit, as we're seeing from the trends, and it also may be funded by young, small donors. So for either of you, are you optimistic about the prospects of being able to save and raise enough money for the news industry? And briefly, where do you see that funding coming from? Small donors, large donors, young people, old people, grant makers, corporations, or should the government fund the news? I know that's a big question. So take any part of it you'd like.
Well, I'm definitely optimistic about saving the local news. I don't think I'd be sitting here on this couch if I wasn't. So I 100% am very optimistic about, the things that are rising from the ashes, as Cassie says. I also think that in today's political climate, people are beginning to understand that there's a lot of good and there's a lot of bad. And I think people have known that for a really long time, especially marginalized communities, people of color, queer folks, LGBTQ folks, women, all these different identity groups have really seen that, local news in general, has not always shown up for them in the way that they've needed these institutions of power to show up, right? And so I think there are, in terms of a lot of the newer nonprofits that are showing up, I believe, so the Institute for Nonprofit News, our fiscal sponsor, releases an INN index every year. And so this last year, the 2020 index, showed that the majority of, that I think it was something like 30% or more of the new nonprofits being started up are millennial and Gen Z founded. So not only are these the people that are donating the news, these are the people innovating the news. Young folks see the benefit of making sure that we can continue creating information that speaks truth to power and that is representative of various communities. And so I do see a lot of, I am very optimistic about it because, I especially from, people like you guys who are watching us right now, you folks at home who are watching, you help drive this. You are what give me optimism and hope because you're tuning in right now, which tells me you care, and this is something that's important to you, or else you wouldn't be here. And so the fact that even anyone is on this live stream right now is really important. In terms of funding, I think there's a lot of talk about whether government should play a role in funding local news. I haven't been able to do enough research. I'll be fully transparent. I haven't been able to do enough research to see how I would really feel about that. But I think at the end of the day, it's going to come from the people. The people are going to choose what is important to them. You already see. I think it was the New York Times just surpassed its digital subscriptions surpassed its newspaper sales for the first time in a really, I think, ever, and that was in the middle of this pandemic, right? So we're seeing this switch to digital as well. So I think people are ready to, people are starting to pay for what they want to see, right? So people are going to start paying for the individual things that they want. So I think it's going to be a lot of community supported, very NPR model right, where you have a lot of individuals donating and sustaining. Also, Newsmatch is really amazing and is obviously such a great support for us. Again, I said this last week, I think. I wouldn't be sitting here, Cassie wouldn't be sitting here. We would not be able to have these positions if it weren't for folks at home. So,
poof, we'd be gone. So if you want to keep us here doing this hard work of evolving Columbus's local news options, please consider donating $5, which is a suggested donation for this event at matternews.org/donate. And if you become a member and just give a small amount to Matter each month, your donation will be multiplied by 12. And if you give just the $5, that'll be actually $10 that we'll get because it'll be doubled. So Ethan, what do you think?
I think this might not be answering the question, but I think we're entering the age of niche news. So some of the things that I think, some of the models or some of the things that I think have been working really, really well outside of Matter News. I think the Ohio Capital Journal, wonderful. I think they're very.
I keep hearing a lot of buzz about them. I haven't gotten to tune into enough of their stuff, but but a lot of people I respect keep saying that they really appreciate them. Yeah.
And then their reporters were also pulled from local papers. It looks like, but they're very solid. Outside of Ohio, one of the big nonprofits, I believe they're nonprofit. They should be Chalkbeat, which is a education. Yeah. And they've been bouncing around. They're in Chicago, but they're now in Nashville and New York, so they've seen their base grow really well.
And for people that don't know, Chalkbeat, I know it has to do with schools, but remind me, what is their
education in Chicago?
In a few other states now, and they have a national.
Oh, sorry. Chalkbeat Chicago is an INN member too, which is why I'm thinking about that.
Yeah.
But they just report on education.
Yeah, they just report on education specifically. The only one that I've seen that's done really well that isn't niche what is the Akron Devil Strip.
And I don't know. So they are a co-op technically,
Okay.
or they're transitioning to one. And I don't remember. We were on
Our
a
co-op. Yeah, I think they are. I think they were in the process, but they still had memberships.
It's super interesting because they're definitely not like a nonprofit quite the way that we are. But they are doing like a co-op model where people can, it's kind of like what we do with donors, but they just have investors, and we kind of call our, donors investors. And so their investors technically own a share of the co-op. And so it's almost like donors. It's just not, because they're not nonprofit. But it's really interesting the way some of these different models work in terms of like how the community can fund a newsroom. There's different ways. It's not just the donor model.
And nonprofit, not to use a double negative, but like in profit, I see in sports.
And sorry, did we mention that the Devil Strip is in Akron,
Yes,
Ohio?
yep.
Okay.
Yep. And in sports, you see a lot of niche journalism, and some of it's growing. So I know like Ohio State football is its own industry within journalism. Like it's one of the only things, and it kind of fascinates me. But it's literally its own industry. But outside of that, you have 270 Sports, which is a basketball. They also have their football publication now. And they're an up and coming publication. They specifically cover basketball or football, just around 270. Ohio Report is growing. That's more rural football, but it covers the entire state. So I think we're entering the age of niche journalism. I think that's the big thing that we're seeing people go more away from finding all of their news on one centralized location and going to these specifics to get their news.
Which, in my humble opinion, is a positive thing, because rather than, getting your news from, ultimately, and who knows, maybe the way I've been thinking about it is not as bad as it is. Maybe there is a little bit more local control in some of our local newsrooms, even if they are corporately owned. But I think ultimately, these bigger companies, they are producing larger amounts of news in all over the, state. And so that just is, at the end of the day, fewer company cultures that are presiding over that content that's made, fewer voices that are involved, fewer content creators telling stories, fewer stories being told, at least in terms of diversity. So I think that it's a positive trend that kind of this niche journalism thing is coming around. And I totally agree that I think like the trends that I'm kind of pulling out, and that, I think reflect in the actual research and studies and whatnot, is really that nonprofit news is definitely on the rise. Niche journalism is definitely on the rise. And I don't know for sure about the stats, but I assume just independent journalism generally is on the rise. And we know that corporate journalism very much is on the decline. So there's some very clear trends there. It'll be interesting. I think those are only going to continue in certain ways to see how they go. So thank you guys so much. Do we have any questions? I don't think we have any major questions that need to be asked from the feeds, and we're already at our hour mark in just a minute. So I'll just remind y'all that we are here tonight and every Monday night through December, this month and through December, talking about different aspects of the news industry. So next week we're going to be talking about who funds Columbus's news, talking about the money. And so we're going to be talking a little bit more in depth about some of the things we started talking about tonight in terms of like who really does pay for the news, and especially in Columbus, like who funds it. And then every week we're going to have a different topic after that. If you look in all of the links in our bios and things like that, you'll find the Eventbrite that has all of those different events, and we're also on Facebook. Please do consider giving $5. That's a suggested donation for tonight at matternews.org/donate. Your donation will be doubled. And if you donate or become a member anytime through the end of the year, you'll get that donation doubled. And if you become a monthly donor and even give as little as like $5 a month, $10 a month, that really helps us be more sustainable, and your donation will be multiplied by 12 the whole year's worth. So it really, really impacts us, especially as a small startup, independent, nonprofit newsroom. So we really appreciate y'all tuning in tonight, and we will catch you next Monday at 7.
Yeah, and if you have any follow-up questions about this, if you're like, hey, remember that stat you said that you weren't quite sure about? What is that stat? Hit us up. We want to definitely have these conversations with you, whether or not it's on a live stream. I'm always on Twitter as a journalist, and so, you can always find me there at Marissa Twig. You can hit us up on email. All of our emails are listed online. And please, we want to have conversations. We want to talk about this stuff, and we want to make sure that we can help our community understand, what's going on with the local news and how it impacts their lives. So thank you all so much for tuning in.
And I want to make sure that we plug that you should definitely stay tuned because, as Marissa said, she's an editor. As Ethan said, he's a contributor for Matter News. And Ethan is currently working on content for Matter, so we'll be having some really great information on the sprawl of Columbus and sort of how development sprawls out and whether or not that's an issue, what's the controversy, so
and
be looking out for that.
Whether or not it can happen, even if, yep.
Whether it's a thing.
Whether it's a thing.
Spoiler alert. Don't give too many spoilers.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So look out for that. I don't know exactly how soon, but it'll be out sometime in the future from Ethan Clewell. So we're very excited for that. And thank you so much for being on tonight. Do you have anything you want to say in closing?
I think news is moving.
That's
Digitally
good.
and visually and soundly. I do believe at some point in time there could be added mediums and talking about mediums within social media and other aspects that need not to be ignored, I guess.
Yes, and I'm sure we will dive into that a little bit more in future episodes when we talk more about independent media. And if you ever tune into anything where we talk more about Matters Model, you'll know that, for example, Ethan does photos. A lot of our content is kind of the classic written explainers, etc. We also do mini documentaries, podcasts. We even want to do in the future first-person video games, get super innovative with it, and expand what it means to give people local news. So thank you all so much. We'll see you here next Monday at 7 p.m. Thank you again to our sponsors, Wild Goose Creative and Night Road Studio. We are out.